So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, can we see my screen, not my notes? Yes, okay, great. So I just kind of a background, a little bit more about Valerie shared my kind of my bio, journalism and design. We're an undergraduate program at the New School, and a lot of our it's pedagogical, like the philosophy that kind of roots in the program itself is journalism that is rooted in design. So human-centered design or design thinking, as is kind of more the popular term that you might think about design, and systems thinking. So what that means for us is that producing journalism and news that is more responsive to people's needs, right? So it's not just like us deciding what the news is and what the news needs to be, but that we're really in conversation with our communities. We're really in touch with our communities. We're in touch with with the public, and creating journalism in creative ways that can respond to the needs that we hear. And also to think about it from a systems lens, right? So that we're not producing stories in a vacuum, right? That we're really thinking about the systems that really dictate the events that we're seeing. And we'll get into this and the kind of we'll offer an example for how to think about this, but that we're placing these things in context, right? That we're not just saying what happened today, but why things are happening, right? And what we can do about them, more importantly. We are kind of incorporate that into a lot of the work that we do. So that's kind of a little bit of a background, and we've been working for a while to to open up our here's the screen here, but we've basically created a lot of tools we've taken a lot of tools from our classroom, and we kind of made them available for educators, for journalists, for any kind of practitioner that is interested in using some of these tools. I will say, I'm a journalist. Our program is rooted in journalism. But system thinking, like the work that we've done around systems thinking, I've just learned from other folks. Like everything that I'm going to talk about, like we've just been kind of digesting and kind of taking bits and pieces from a lot of different sources and trying to filter it through the lens of journalism, right? Systems thinking as a practice is rooted in there's like systems dynamics and a lot of like MIT grads and who are really thinking about just really fundamentally how systems work, like modeling systems that get into everything from like the natural world and climate change to actual like companies, like how to more effectively manage a large a company, right? How to there's some text that I'll share as well that we put together a lot of resources that this talk is rooted from that kind of pull from all of these different focuses, right? We tried to think about, okay, well, what does system thinking mean for journalism, right? And more broadly, even if you're not a journalist, what systems thinking can bring to our work around narrative, around storytelling, around information sharing, right? Journalism is a profession, like we need professional journalists, and we all commit acts of journalism all the time, right? We all encounter stories, we all participate in, hear, and shape narratives about our work and our communities, right? So if we're thinking about the tools of journalism, right, we can use those and apply those to all the work that we do to better, one, understand some of the issues that are at the heart of the work that we're doing, to understand our communities and what's going on, and understand kind of the issues that we're facing, and how we can really elevate stories and narratives that can help us understand ways to move forward, right, that address some of these structural issues. So I'll pause here for a second, and I wanted to kind of go back to this question that you saw flash here, but this is kind of at the core of the session today. What role does storytelling play in systems change? And so I wanted to pause just for a second and let us reflect on that. I know there's a lot of expertise in this room, and I'm only offering one perspective. I'm curious, like when you think about this question, what this means to you. Why did you come to the session, and what role do you think storytelling plays in systems change? You can type something in the chat if you want, or feel free to unmute, raise your hand if you'd like to share. Anybody? Any volunteers? of someone saying who or what would be determining the story is a very important point, and something that we talk a lot about in, I think a lot of time in news, right? You hear people in the news talk about, oh, well, are you covering both sides of the issue, right? And in reality, there's more than just two sides to anything. There's like a multitude of different sides and experiences and perspectives, right? So that who is determining the story, right? Like where you are situated within the system, right, is very important. And it's more than just taking a systems perspective can help us step outside of this like binary, right, and look at the complexity of the world. So Pat says, telling our own stories can help others realize that they are not alone in their challenge, right? Connecting others, like really placing us within the system. Yeah. Bringing people together, right? I think that's the similar kind of connects to what Pat was saying, right? That we're offering these opportunities to see ourselves like in relationship, right? Which is really what systems is about, is like understanding relationships, right? Understanding how these relationships work, understanding connections and how those connections work. Learning from stories of the past. Yes, absolutely, right? We can see patterns, we can see trends, we can see how the past kind of informs where we are and what we can learn from that. Yeah. And storytelling with our communities can help better understand and identify root issues. Yes. Connect and collaborate. I'm so glad you brought up collaboration, because that is a key part of system change, is how do we work together? Because individually we cannot shift the system, but if we work together, right, that is the key thing. We all play a role in the issues that we see, right? We all have some kind of, and we all have agency, right? So how do we kind of work together? How do we collaborate? Telling history in terms of storytelling, so it makes it palatable and digestible to many people, right? Who, I do think people are hungry. I think that kind of gets to like, people are hungry for stories about systems, right? I think a lot of times and especially I think even post-pandemic, I think really systems was kind of like a buzzword. And I think I heard this phrase during 2020 a lot, which was COVID has laid our systems bare. I saw that I was going to set up a Google alert for literally that phrase. And I think it's really, people always knew, we've always known about systems, but I think like we're seeing more of an awareness and more of a hunger for these types of stories. And then Karin's sharing that, people need storytelling to understand what's shifting around them, right? How again, placing ourselves in the system, really understanding where we are in the system. Was saying change begins with the telling of stories, and there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. Yeah, so it's really surfacing, like making these things known and making, shifting our own awareness, right? As we'll talk a little bit more about, like story helps us, it really shapes our understanding of reality, right? These are the stories that we tell, we're social creatures, right? We only know what we experience and what we have formulated, as what our understanding of reality is. So that kind of that sharing of story and kind of connecting people within these narratives is super important for us to even understand what the issue is, right? Like what is actually happening. And storytelling makes people feel valued, right? That I think that's super important to really think about, even people being recognized and seen, and that we are really elevating people and stories that haven't really been told, that we've overlooked or purposefully marginalized and kept from, from us really like seeing the extent of some of these stories. So really, really great. Thank you for sharing all that, everybody. I really appreciate you're making a lot of points for me already. And so this really is connecting with a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today. So I wanted to kind of quickly get into some definitions. And I want to real quick before I even move ahead, everything I talk about today, I'll share all the slides. This is a screenshot of a website that we put together called Systems Thinking for Journalists. A lot of the materials, there's all a bunch of open source exercises and tools that we put together, resources, reading lists. It's all geared specifically for like journalism, but I think they can be relevant. So I'll have a link to that as well, so you can also dig deeper and use a lot of these things. And there's a lot more resources there as well for you to check out. So a couple definitions real quick to help ground us. So what is a system, right? So a simple definition of a system is a set of interconnected dynamic parts that together form a whole with a function or a purpose, right? So systems are all around us, right? Public transportation, a basketball team, the ocean, you know, your organization, right? Your body, right? Systems, these are all systems. And systems have a primary purpose, as stated in this definition, right? So you think about a basketball team, right? Purpose of a basketball team is to win games, right? Draw fans who generate revenue, and you know you can sell advertising against to make money, right? Uh, and in order to understand the purpose of a system, we have to look at the connections between the elements of that system, right? So it's not even just about the elements, but the relationship between them, right? Because you can replace individual elements within a system in a lot of ways, and it will still function in similar ways, right? It will still work toward that same purpose. But if you change the connections, that changes the system and how it operates, right? So for example, back to the basketball team, if you change all the individual players on a basketball team, you still have a basketball team, right? If you change the rules of the game from basketball to football, that's an entirely different game, right? Even if you have the same player. So the relationship is what we're really interested in when we talk about systems, right? And those connections. And we'll come back to that, like how we're really focusing the stories on, it's the stories that we tell on not just the parts of the system. A lot of times we focus on the pieces, right? But not the relationships, the structures, the connections that really drive those parts and what we're seeing, you know, what we're seeing happening. So the next definition is around what is systems thinking, right? So when we say systems thinking, we're talking about, it's really this set of tools and this framework for understanding complex issues and opportunities for change, right? A lot of systems thinking, in the field of systems thinking, there's a lot of different, you know, focuses and I guess like fields within the systems thinking umbrella. Social change is a big piece of it, right? So understand how systems work so that we can work toward better systems, right? Make our systems healthier, produce better outcomes, right? So systems thinking is really a study of the whole rather than the parts in isolation, right? And it's this set of tools, it's a mindset, right? Then for seeing this interconnectedness, for seeing and helping us understand what's driving our most complex issues. It's a practice to explore like how systems work, how they're built, and again, identifying these opportunities for change, right? And as journalists, you know, kind of tying into the work that we do, systems thinking, you know, asks us to go deeper to not just like what is happening, we see what is happening, but why and how things are happening, right? I'll say also like, this isn't, a lot of the concepts, this isn't rocket science in a lot of ways. Like a lot of us already think this way. What we'll talk about today and what I'm really going over is really, hopefully it's more of like a language, a vocabulary, or even like a framework for really thinking about how you probably already think, right? But just putting some different language to it, some words, to give you some additional tools and resources to really think about systems and think about how storytelling and narrative plays a role in our own understanding of the systems and our opportunities to actually change them for the better. So a couple things that systems thinking can help us do. At its most fundamental, it's about asking a different set of questions, right? Ones that take a step back, that look at those underlying causes, as somebody mentioned, those root causes, right, for some of these complex issues that we're focusing on, and opportunities to intervene, right? So I don't, in this, I'm not going to give you a lot of prescriptive advice, right? Like this is how you think in a systems way. This is about questions. It's about a perspective. It's a mindset, right? And so there's no one way to tell a system story or to tell something from a systems perspective, right? It's a process, right? We don't have a playbook. It's more like a compass. And so it's really about these questions that we're asking and getting to the different set of questions that makes this this mindset powerful. Someone mentioned collaboration, right? Systems thinking is about learning from and collaborating with people across the system, right? How do you make sure that you're really getting input from all of the different people and players and stakeholders so that you can fully understand and get a better picture of how the system works and how it impacts people in different ways? You only know as much as your own experience and the information that you have. That's where journalism kind of comes in, is that, you know, we're really good at talking to a lot of people and gathering information. You know, researchers do similar things. Like if you're working in your community, you're talking to a lot of people. Like you don't have to be a capital J journalist, right, or a professional journalist, working journalist to get that perspective, right, on how, you know, your community works and what some of the issues are. So this learning from and collaborating with a variety of stakeholders is really, really key. And it's really important for us to really consider who our understanding is informed by, who might not be in the conversation, who we need to actually talk with more and learn from more to get a better understanding of how the system works. And at its core, this is really about complexity, right? Our world is not simple, right? These problems that we all are working on they don't have simple answers. There's no one solution to ending homelessness, right? There's no silver bullet here. And we also think that, I like to say this too, we talk about solutions, but a lot of times complex problems are never really solved. They change, right? And they morph, and we have to adapt, right? This is just the nature of what systems thinking can help us do, is be adaptive, right? To, as things change, we can try one thing and maybe it helps the system in some way, or maybe the problem that we're working on in some way, but maybe it causes another issue that we didn't think about because we weren't thinking about that part of the system, right? So that complexity is really key and is really, it's core to what we're talking about, and what systems thinking can help us at least like account for a little bit better in the work that we're doing. And this last bullet here, it's not about, we're talking about orienting systems toward health, equity, possibility, right? I'll get to this in a minute, but I guess the idea about impact, right? In the work that we do, this is a little bit more of a, not, I guess, traditional systems thinkers aren't talking all the time about health and equity and possibility, but I bring this up because I feel like this is where we kind of play a role, the work of storytellers and journalists and media makers and narrative agents, right? That we have the opportunity to think about, sharing stories and narratives that help us understand how the world could be better, right? How we could achieve better outcomes, how our systems could work toward the benefit of more people, right? And so that orientation is really important. One way to think about this is a model that we use a lot, the iceberg model. So this is a kind of a light bulb moment for me when I first saw this, and I think it's a really good example of how we can think about it. So most of the time we pay attention to the tip of the iceberg, right? So what is happening, right? What we see. And if we're taking kind of a journalism news standpoint on this, that's what a lot of news coverage focusing on, like what happened yesterday, right? What's the events that we are seeing and that we can cover? But when we go a step below the waterline, we start to see how those events are connected, right? What's happening over time? What are the trends and patterns that are happening? These trends kind of help us find the rhythm of the system and how it's functioning, right? So we can kind of see, start to put these pieces together, right? And journalism can kind of do this sometimes as well. Like we looked at data, we look at, take more of a historical perspective, as someone mentioned earlier, right? We can start to kind of see some of those trends over time. Now you go a level deeper and we start to see the system structure, right? So these are the policies, the rules, the power dynamics that dictate how a system operates and what is fueling those trends and patterns, which are then producing the events that we see, right? And then at the very bottom are what we call mental models, right? And so these really drive and dictate how the system is built, why the system was built how it is, or why the system operates as it operates, right? These are the beliefs, the assumptions, the worldviews that really fundamentally dictate how we see the world and why we design systems in different ways. Mental models kind of explain why like two different people that have two different value systems can make very different conclusions about the same set of facts or about a particular issue, right? That understanding of, of our own experience of how the world works and what is right and what is wrong, like those mental models inform how we structure systems, why a system, a particular problem might become entrenched, right? Because of our way of thinking around that system, right? And so this bottom layer is the hardest to grapple with because often these mental models they're just so ingrained, right? It's hard even to step back and see them. And even when we know they're there, it's hard to kind of really get past them because they're so deeply embedded in our systems. But they're key. They have the highest amount of leverage. When we talk about systems change, this is how you change systems. Donella Meadows, who was one of the great systems thinkers. We draw from her work a lot. She passed several years ago, but she she wrote a newspaper column. She was like an MIT, did a lot of like really systems dynamic, like a lot of deep systems dynamics work, and wrote some really foundational texts about systems theory. Amazing. Check her work out. It's really incredible. But she wrote a newspaper column for her local newspaper for years, and there's a collection of her columns. Then in the introduction to that column, she talks about that. Well, even backing up, mental models in one of her other texts was she talked about mental models being the highest leverage point. That if you change the way people think, you can change the system, right? And in her collection of columns, she wrote that why she wrote those columns was because the media had the opportunity to change the way people think, right? And it doesn't happen with one story. It happens with stories over time. It happens with telling these things over and over and telling these stories again and again, because that is what changes the way that it changes our perspective. It changes how we see the world, how we understand an issue, how we understand our connection to an issue, right? And she saw the power of that and why she wrote this newspaper column. So it was a really interesting connection for us when we think about mental models and the role of story, right? The role of narrative in shifting and changing systems. That's where it lies. It's really hard. This is not simple. Nothing that we're talking about here today is easy. This is just a little bit of an orientation and a little bit of like a perspective around the relationships, right? How narrative and story plays a role and can play a role in system change. I also talked about solutions earlier. I mean, I'd like to share this perspective because we say all the time that systems are broken. Most systems aren't really broken. Systems are working. Remember, we talked about every system has a purpose, right? Systems are producing exactly what they were designed to produce, right? They're probably just producing things that we don't want to see, or that some people are benefiting from in some way, and that others are being harmed by. That this is some of these things are intentional, some are unintentional, but systems are built. They're not broken, right? And the opportunity here is that if systems are not, if they're built, like we can redesign them, right? We can think about orienting them toward health and equity and what's the possibility here? How can we change this system? How can we change the relationships in the system to produce better outcomes, right, for more people? That's really what we're thinking about when we think about systems change, right, is shifting that system in some way. So it kind of brings us to the idea of narrative. And I kind of bridge, there's a lot of work out there around narrative shift. And there's a lot of really great organizations that do narrative shift work, and just a ton of really great resources that I recommend, some of which are linked in on our website that I think Valerie shared earlier, the resource page. There's several books around narrative shift that you can check out. There's the Narrative Initiative is a really great organization that has a lot of resources to talk about what is narrative. And here's a definition that they came up with for narrative change. Is a narrative reflects a shared interpretation of how the world works. Who holds power, how they use it is both embedded in and supported by dominant narratives. Successful narrative change shifts power as well as dominant narratives. And one thing, I can't believe I've talked this whole time and I haven't even said the word, I don't think I've said it yet, power, right? When we talk about systems, it's really a conversation about power, how power works, right? Who has it, who doesn't, right? How power functions within a system. As journalists, a key mission of journalism is to hold the powerful accountable, right? And a lot of times we hold individuals who have power accountable, but not taking a step back at holding a system accountable, right? So we're really thinking about that idea of power really shows up here, kind of a departure from the narrative piece here, but an idea that I think is really important for us to think about is like how power works. But I really like this definition because it, kind of places us in what is a narrative, right? It's this shared interpretation. And when you think about the mental models, it's a part of that narrative. To give you an example, a story, to break this down and kind of define our terms a bit more here, right? If we talk about a story, stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? They inform narratives, which are these shared understandings, which are collections of stories, right? They're collections of stories that fuel our shared understanding. And then those narratives inform deep narratives, which is basically what we're talking about in the mental models, right? These are that really just shape the fabric of our understanding of how the world works, right? So they kind of get to these more ingrained narratives that just exist, right? That, whether it be about capitalism or whether it be about, the best way to raise a child or whatever it might be, these narratives just kind of become a part of our society, right? They become a part of just our shared social contract. And so when we start to think about some of our entrenched social issues, we can look at those deep narratives and think about how we start to counter them, how we inform them, how we shift them, right? What are the narratives that we can elevate? What narratives need to be shifted? And then what stories can be elevated to shift those narratives, right? That can kind of get us closer to that deep narrative shift. And as we talked about, as Danella Meadow said, this is really hard, right? It's hard to just fundamentally change the way people think. And as we've seen, especially in the past couple of years, right, people are becoming more entrenched and in bubbles, and it's harder even when presented with facts to get people to think differently, to get people to actually engage with stories or with information that might not actually resonate with their current mental models, right, with their worldview. And so that's a challenge for us. That's actually something that we have to work on, is how do we and how can our work in story and narrative create this shared understanding, right? Because that's what we're kind of losing right now in a lot of ways, because we can get a lot of information with the internet, and we can also create these silos where once we had a little bit more, that's debatable. There was a little bit more of a way to create more of a shared understanding, right? And I think that's breaking down in different ways, and so it's part of the big challenge that we have, and that is really key to really think about systems. We think about this idea and the opportunity of narrative, like how narrative can cross boundaries and create more of the shared understanding to really fuel and influence just our basic understanding of how the world works, right? And then that kind of informs the decisions that we make, right? And this is just deep philosophy. So it's kind of where we are with narrative. So I want to pause really quickly. If you have questions or if any of these coming up, please feel free to throw things in the chat, and I'll get to them as I go. I'm going to get to a couple examples here to kind of apply some of these ideas. We worked with the Baltimore Sun a couple years ago. They did a project about child support, and specifically the child support system in Baltimore, and how it basically, in a lot of cases, right, harms fathers and harms parents more than it helps them. And so you have the system that is, the fundamental purpose of it is to support children and families. And when you look at the actual system, when these reporters examined it, they saw the opposite. They saw a system that was punitive against many Black fathers, right, who were punished in a system for not being able to make a payment. And this is not a simple story. This is not a black and white story. Life is complex, right? There was a lot of different perspectives to this story. But the deep narrative here was this idea of the deadbeat dad, right? And this is what the reporters and the editor on the story were really trying to kind of get at with their reporting, is that to kind of challenge this notion of the deadbeat dad. Because yeah, of course, do some fathers not pay their child support? Yeah, absolutely. But they saw on the data and they saw in their reporting that that's for many other fathers that were trying to go through the system. They were encountering these obstacles and barriers to actually supporting the families, right? They would miss a payment and get their license revoked. Maybe they lost their job, and then they get your license revoked. You can't go to your job, so then you lose your job, and then you have to find other ways to make money, and maybe that puts you in trouble with the law at some point. Maybe then you go to jail, and then you get deeper into the cycle. And so they were able to do reporting on how the system works to show the different ways that specific policies and connections within the system actually can drive fathers deeper into debt, into places where you can never recover. And so it was kind of challenging this idea when you really think about this narrative of the idea that this is what the reporter was saying. There's this idea of a deadbeat dad, and this story that we can tell is a way to influence that narrative and to help shift that narrative so we can have a better understanding of the system and how it's actually designed in ways that harm people instead of support them. I'll just quickly, I won't really get into the full details of this. This is the systems map. So we actually created a systems map. This is one of the key kind of tools that you can use in systems thinking, is actually creating a visual of how the system works and how the relationships connect to each other, how the pieces of the system connect to each other, rather. I won't try to really navigate this because they're really overwhelming to kind of look at, but they can be tools to help us really see connections within a system. This is an approximation. This is a model, right? This isn't like gospel, but it is a way for us to kind of understand some of those connections, some of the pieces of the system and how they connect to each other. So if you look on our website, there's a whole bunch of material about how to create a systems map, and this can be useful in any work that you do to help you get an understanding of an issue that you're working on or a connection. We've done this in several different cases, and I really recommend thinking about, even if you don't have to create something as like complex as this, but even doing this on your own, like creating kind of a simple systems map and just drawing out some connections, going through some of those exercises can be illuminating. So I'll just plug that before we move on. Another quick example, we worked with New Hampshire Public Radio this was a couple of years ago. This is before, I think this is back in, what year is this now? 2019. So it was before the 2020 elections. This is like before the primaries were happening, the presidential primaries were happening. They wanted to do a different take on the presidential primary in New Hampshire. They didn't want to just tell the same old story, right? Show up at the events that the candidates were hosting and, just cover, basically just PR for the candidate and horse race type coverage. They wanted to actually look at the primary system in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the first in the nation with a primary. It's a point of pride for the state, right? So instead of, well, they did kind of the normal coverage but they also wanted to go a level deeper and look at not just what was happening, but like why. They wanted to actually look at the system itself, right? They wanted to think about sorry, I'm kind of like lost myself here. They focused on the institutional foundations of the New Hampshire primary. They looked at how power works specifically, right? Who has power? Why? How did it come to be that New Hampshire was the first in the nation primary, right? Who are the people that like keep this in place? Like, why is this such a tradition, right? That that the candidates participate in, and who benefits from that and who loses out, right? So they took a step back and created this podcast that really examined the foundation of this institution, the New Hampshire primary. It actually pissed a lot of people off because people were just like, "How dare you, question this thing? Like, this is just how we do it." And it was really interesting to see them get that pushback that they did, and it does kind of raise the flag that when you ask questions about why things are the way that they are, right, you can get some pushback, right? Because especially if people are benefiting from a system as it's currently designed, you're going to encounter some blowback, right? And so it's interesting to see that kind of feedback coming up, and just how I really recommend you checking out this podcast. It's really fascinating, even if you don't live in New Hampshire, to just get an understanding of the history behind this, right? Someone talked about the history, bringing that in, where did this even come from? How was this system built, right? They examined those foundations and really looked at these deep narratives around why this is the way that it is, right? So it's really fascinating look at the primary. So those are two examples. We're going to get into a conversation. We're actually going to think about this for a second. I'm going to stop my screen here for a second so we can just chat for a minute. I haven't been following the chat as much, if there have been points kind of coming up. I want to just pause for a second, throw a ton of material at you, and just open it up for questions, reflections, thoughts. Does this resonate? How does this connect to your work? What is this bringing up for you? I just wanted to kind of have a quick conversation, and then we can, I have a couple questions I wanted to ask us to carry this forward in your own work as well. So questions, comments. You can feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to just unmute and share, that's fine as well.
Cool. Sorry. No, I was going to say we had an interesting question come into the chat from someone about how the corporate acquisition of small town papers challenges all of this and blurs the lines between the national and the local. I thought you might want to speak to that, Cole, and open up that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, this is just my take, is that I feel like when you see the consolidation of media, right, you see more of like a nationalization, even in the coverage that we see. A loss of local news means a loss of an understanding of what's happening in our communities. And that means a loss of connection to our community, right? And so I feel like there becomes this attention of what's happening at the national level more than what's happening in our backyard in a lot of ways, because we don't, there's a loss of coverage, right? There's a loss of news, that shared understanding of what's going on locally. So I think that to me kind of plays a role, and I think blurs, I think blur the lines is a good way to phrase it, but it also like shifts our lens, right? That we're paying attention and putting a lot of, we're thinking about the White House, and who's in the White House, and when a lot of times, like, all politics is local, right? We think about how power functions locally, like how, I mean, even look at, focus on like school boards and libraries and like, what's going on locally. And so I think like that to me, obviously I am a huge advocate for local news, and like I think it's it's a threat to democracy that we're losing local news outlets. And I'm also encouraged, I would say, that there's a lot of new news organizations opening up, nonprofit organizations, a lot of like folks who are doing really, really interesting work that are more connected to like civics, to more connected to systems change, that I'm really encouraged by. So it's not all doom and gloom. I don't want to just be like, it's terrible. There are good things happening. I would say that that's how I would, the loss of, especially newspapers collapsing specifically, has been damaging. And you look at something like local TV news, which is oftentimes sensational, focusing on crime, focusing on, a lot of like the really bad negative things that can actually inform the narratives. When you look at the election, there was a big narrative about crime and the increase in crime. Now, did the data reflect it? It wasn't as simple of a picture as like crime is up across the board, right? You may think that if you tune into the news, the local news, but that might not be the case, right? So those stories do shape our understanding of reality, and they shape how we vote. They shape what we care about, what we focus on. Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cole, for this really great series today. I had a quick question. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in our collective impact work, and especially with systems change, has been kind of like operating in silos and, people kind of working towards similar goals and visions, but, finding it difficult to connect. So I just wanted to ask, in your experience, has there been anything coming up like that? If you had any recommendations for how to, kind of make those bridges, I guess, and, especially with storytelling and making sure that, we're not coming back to people and continuously getting their stories and, kind of taking that away, but making sure that, we're really elevating those stories really effectively.
Yeah, I mean, collaboration is hard, and it's essential at the same time. Like, we have to work together. I think there's a lot of different, it depends on it depends on the circumstances, right? I would say a lot of times it's like, we encountered this a lot when we were like trying to get all the stakeholders in the room on a particular issue, right? And there were some stakeholders who didn't want to come to the table because they felt like they were just going to get attacked, right? That this was about them, and that this was just like an intervention to like get them to do something differently. And a way to kind of think about approaching this is like, look, we're all a part of this, and we all have a shared goal. And so some of this is like finding the shared goals. Like, what are some of the common threads that run through your work, right? Some of the shared visions that you might have. So things like visioning exercises, I think, can be really helpful. That kind of can set goals for any kind of collaboration that you're trying to do. That also just surface like what do people want, right? What would help them want to participate more, is something that we've done that has worked pretty well. Trying to find like a neutral ground, right? Really thinking even like, if you're meeting in a place, like where are you meeting? Like what time are you meeting? Like, do people feel welcome in the space that you're meeting in? And I think like if people are hesitant about getting involved, it just takes a lot of work and a lot of like one-on-one outreach to those folks too. And a lot of, it's just relationships, right? It's just really connecting and making sure that people's concerns are being heard, right? And, that they're being addressed, right? How can you, if there's hesitation or just like some pushback, right? How can you think about this like conflict resolution almost, right? Like, how do you think about like surfacing some of those, some of that pushback, and then, how it's kind of addressed in the work. I think for the storytelling, I mean, I don't know if this is kind of getting to what you were, like your question, but like, we deal with this a lot in journalism. Is like, if you've ever, like every journalist should have a story written about them. They should be reported on, because you get that experience of like, we're like, that wasn't really what I said though, you always have that experience. And it's impossible to like get a story 100% right. You know what I mean? Like you can't fully, like, experience is so complex, like you'll never capture that. Like, I mean, maybe you can get close, right? And that's what we can hope for. But I think like as much as we can kind of, if we're sharing stories, if we're elevating people's stories, that we are checking in with them, right? There's a lot of work around, what's it called? Solidarity journalism. I'll have to look this up and share it, but there's a lot of good steps for storytelling that actually does, especially if we're working with, marginalized communities, for, how do you check in with people when you're elevating a story to make sure you're not just like being extractive in that process, right? That it can be collaborative, that it could be that you're really, doing everything that you can to be as accurate and to really reflect what that person is trying to share. Sometimes it's like challenging with journalistic standards, because like you can't let a person really dictate a story, if it's not actually how, if you're getting, reports that, well, I mean, yes, and there's some of this going on too. So that part can be sensitive when you really are trying to like, paint a full picture of like what happened. This is very circumstantial, but I think that I'll get those resources and share them as well, because I think it's really important for, how we check in with people, how we share their story, that people feel like they have a clear understanding of like how their story is going to be shared, right? Because a lot of times like journalists there's no expectation, right, around like, oh, if I talk to you, then what? Like, what happens then? I don't actually know. How will my story be used? Like, where does it go? And so having a better understanding, even preparing people for that upfront, can go a long way, like really answering any questions that they have about the process. I often ask, like, what questions do you have for me, right? Like, what can I help with? And so those are a couple of things. Julie, does that help? Does that get to where you were going with?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Cole. Those are really, really helpful insights, and I'd love to get any information on the solidarity journalism for sure. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I'll make a note of that.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Julia.
Cole, I have a quick question. Many years ago, we're talking about almost 30 years ago, I was a stringer for a newspaper. And I remember at that time, you were sent in to get the story. You were asked to get a balanced view. And you were advised you would get requests from people occasionally, can I look at the story before you publish it? And at that time, that was absolutely a no-no. You did not do that. Is there a shift now where, journalists are sharing exactly what they're going to put into a story?
I think most journalists would tell you that no, you don't share a story with sources ahead of time. I think it is, my take on it depends, right? Would I share it with a city council person to make sure that they're no, I'm not going to share it with the person in power, because like, I'm not going to give you an opportunity to make yourself look better, like in that case. And this is where we talk about power, right? Like who actually has power. Now, if, you are, if we're, centering someone who's been a victim of assault in some way, or, there's a really sensitive issue, I do want to share more, to make sure that I'm accurately reflecting their experience, that they understand, right, like how their story is going to be shared. My former colleague at the Center for Investigative Reporting, Trey Bundy's amazing reporter, he always said that he would do everything in his power to convince the person not to talk to him, right? Just to say like, here's everything, when your story gets out there, like, here's what happens, like it cannot be good. And so it depends, right? And I think it all kind of, a lot of time the practice is so that people don't have a chance to like rewrite, things. They're like, well, actually, no, I didn't really say it that way. It's like, well, you did. I mean, this is why we were, do kind of record things for notes and can kind of refer back to things like that. But I would say for the most part, no, most policies would be like, we don't share stories. I would say it depends, depending on like whose story, right, you're sharing and how what kind of input you should get from them. That's it. Does that make sense? Cool. Great question. It's a very specific practice that I think most people don't get, right? And this is what I actually tell a lot of journalists all the time is like, the vast majority of people have no idea like what goes on in journalism or why, like what the ethics are, right? Like, I don't know why that's a policy. Like, why shouldn't I be able to look at my quote? You know what I mean? Like, I don't, but journalists kind of scoff, like, how dare you like think that you could look at the story beforehand? And like, well, I didn't go to journalism school, right? I don't have that foundation. And like, we can get some of those bits and pieces, but I think we have a job, not just as journalists, but as storytellers, as like narrative agents, right? That to be more transparent about our own methods, practices, how we make decisions, right? That can get us to create more buy-in, right? To actually get to, that we're really not, I'm not trying to be extractive and like share your story. I'm just trying to like create more of an understanding of what's happening, right? Gar.
I have a question that it kind of comes out of my background in history, actually, but I think you might have a different take on it that would be really interesting for our group, which is when you're trying to understand a system in order to tell its story, how do you identify the least powerful stakeholders within that system, the people who are least likely to rise to the surface as having a voice already?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do that. I mean, in reporting, it's really doing the groundwork to think about, okay, well, you look at like who, I mean, again, it comes back to power, like who has power, who doesn't, right? And you can kind of start to see, okay, this is where like the mapping tools can actually be really helpful. Not just a systems map, but a stakeholder map. There's a stakeholder mapping exercise on our website that I found really, really useful. It's just listing anybody who has any remote connection to the system, right? And then you can start to ask questions about those individual, groups or communities or stakeholders, right? And say, how are they affected by the system? Like, what power do they have? How do they contribute to the system? So there's some questions that you can kind of go, if you look at all of the stakeholders, you can kind of do this exercise. And I think it's really important to also look at yourself, your own experience. This is where we check our own biases, right? And say like, what am I limited? I'm limited by the knowledge that I have in my own mental models and my own experiences, right? That absolutely come up, even when I'm listing the stakeholders and the questions that I'm asking. So even diversifying that process to bring in other people to help enrich your own understanding of even who the stakeholders are and how the system is impacting them or how they are affecting the system in some way, I think is really important, right? So challenging your own assumptions and even naming them, I think going into it, I was like, just as a report, like name your assumption. What do you assume is going on here? Because it's good to like write that down so you can challenge that and be like, oh, actually, you know what? This is what I didn't really think about it. So there's a couple things to think about, how do you think about the different stakeholders, ask different questions about how they're affected, and how do you kind of diversify even where your input is coming from to give you a more richer understanding of it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So Valerie, do we have till 30 after the hour? Do we have time, or are we wrapping now?
We technically planned for 75 minutes, but
okay.
Cool. we have some flexibility.
We have a little bit of time. Okay, yeah. So we've got a couple more minutes. So before we wrap, I wanted to put up this question again, and I want us to just like reflect on this for a second. I'm going to share my screen again. If you have more questions, please do throw them in the chat, and I'll get to them. I don't want to cut the conversation short at all. Here's something I just wanted to offer us to kind of reflect on for a few minutes. Is what narratives perpetuate inequity or power imbalances in your communities? And this could be communities that you're a part of, communities that you work with in some way, whatever it might be, whatever community, however you want to interpret like that phrase, your communities. Think about some narratives, right? And And if you're able, if you either on your computer or if you have a pen and paper, write a sentence, like write the sentence of what that narrative is, right? If you could just even like the story of that narrative in a sentence, what would that narrative be? So we're talking about narratives that perpetuate inequity or power imbalances in your communities. We're going to take about just 5 minutes. I'm going to give us all, this is like self-reflection time. And then I have one follow-up question to this. And then we'll share some as a group and see what we come up with. So try to write a sentence that it just articulates what that narrative is. Now remember, back to our definition of what a narrative is. A narrative is a collection of stories that helps us work toward a shared understanding, right? So what is that shared understanding? And it could, and again, this is like, these are narratives that are harmful. We're trying to pinpoint narratives that need to be challenged, right? So just because you're writing the sentence, it doesn't mean that you personally believe that, right? It's just something that you have heard in your work, or that you hear, or that you see exists, and that is actually something that perpetuates inequity, or that perpetuates a power imbalance. Any questions? Feel free to unmute or throw in the chat if you have questions about this. Take about 2 more minutes. Again, we're thinking about narratives that perpetuate inequity or power imbalances in your communities that you work with. Again, this is not something that you personally, a narrative that you believe, but that you have observed or heard or seen that that you feel might be problematic. I'm appreciating folks who have shared in the chat the narratives. If you'd like to share what you have written, please feel free to do that in the chat, and we'll discuss. But if you are inclined to share in the chat, please go for it. I have one more follow-up question, and then we'll discuss. But let's give us like 30 more seconds to wrap up if you're writing something, thinking about that narrative that perpetuates inequity. So once we've kind of identified our narratives here, here's our follow-up question, is Krista. This is where the creativity kind of comes in, is what stories or whose stories can be elevated to inform or shift those narratives, right? So back to the story, collection of stories are what we use to inform the narratives. Like, what are those stories, right? What are those stories that we can start to elevate? And this is probably something that you're already working on, right? Or that you're already seeing. So, and I appreciate these contributions in the chat, right? As Chris said, like the narrative of left versus right, right? How do we think about stories that kind of break open that it's not just left and right, right? That there aren't just like two sides and it's just Republicans or Democrats, and those are the, so stories that work toward that. Reflect on that for a minute. Some good ones coming in. Thank you all for sharing in the chat. We'll get to these in 1 second. So for everybody that shared, again, now we're thinking about these stories that could be elevated. How do we challenge or inform? Like I say, challenge, inform is a softer way to think about it. And but challenge, right? Shift. We're really thinking about expanding people's understanding of, like, you know, that narrative, right? Like how do we tell that story? Like, whose story needs to be told? Or maybe they're already being told, but they just need to be elevated more, right? How do we think about those stories? I think Carolyn's sharing a really good point in the chat right now, and I think this is the point is, it's hard to get the people who need to be heard to tell their story because for so long they haven't been listened to, right? And for journalists, and speaking just for myself and the folks that I work with most closely, is there's a lot of damaged trust, right, for the news. Like people, especially like communities of color, immigrant communities, like have long been harmed by news, by media, right? They see these narratives that are perpetuated about their communities that are harmful, and see negative stories. They never see positive stories. Like, this is what you'll hear, time and again. And so I think that piece is really key. And for us to really think about harm, right? The harm that has been caused, and trust, right? How we actually earned the trust of people to be able to elevate stories that need to be elevated, right? And there's a lot of damage that's been done. And so we have to actually think about that when we're doing narrative work, right? To understand how we can, best support people in telling these stories, and to best like address and acknowledge, right, harm that has been done, and really account for that. Yeah. So 1 more second, then I'm going to ask for volunteers to share. I know we've got some good ones in the chat, and I hope somebody will just raise your hand and share. But let's wrap up thinking about these stories that can be elevated to inform or shift these narratives, and then I'll ask for a volunteer before we close. I really appreciate, Julia, your comment here about public health and social determinants of health. My wife has actually went to grad school for public health, and I've long really been interested in these, like the intersections between journalism and basically a public health approach to journalism, right? And like how we tell stories and how we should, and I really appreciate that, because, and that's the systems approach, the social determinants of health, that's talking about systems, right? that's not blaming people for behaviors, right? The individual within a system, but showing, right, how structured, how people are incentivized to make certain choices, how they actually can't make healthier choices because they don't actually have any healthy food options in their community, right? That's the system story, right? That's what we're talking about. I don't know, Carolyn, you raised your hand. You want to jump in on that?
I didn't want to overstep my friend Pat, who had her first. But if you, I was going to comment on the public health thing as an ACEs, we've been doing a lot of trauma work for the past 4 or 5 years in New Jersey, which we're proud of because we need to bring light to all of that. And, and that systems change is starting to happen with the fact that in talking about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences and learning about it, people realize that it's not, what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And that is a big thing that's happening now. And to be able to see that and be a part of it, it's very exciting, but there's way too many things we need to fix. Go ahead, Pat.
Excellent. Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you, Julia, for sharing. Pat, would you like to share?
Yeah, actually, it's a question as well as a comment.
Great.
When you had us do the first portion of the 2 questions, one of the things that I came up with was related to my local community, where there is the perception that people who live in Midtown, which is the lower income area of the city or of the community, don't have the time, don't have the energy, don't have the income to participate fully in their children's education.
Mm-hmm.
And when you asked, how do we change that perception? I guess I've bought that same narrative. So how do we get to change that situation? I want feedback from other people. What is the alternative narrative? How do we build the positive side of it?
I'll open it up to the group. Yeah. Does anybody? I don't want to dominate this conversation.
I don't want to dominate either. However, when I worked in Pennsauken, the vice president of the Board of Education, who was the only woman of color on the board, asked us that as union people, why don't parents show up to board meetings? And I'm like, do you realize that they're taking care of their kids or working a second job to put food on the table, or they don't speak the language, so they're not really, they don't understand, or the fact that the superintendent is very, very intimidating and does so school's not really the most welcoming thing place. So they're just
that's the narrative that I want to change. What's the other side of that? Because I know that's true in many cases, but how do we lift up the fact that that's not the case everywhere, and that where it is the case, we as a school have a responsibility to do something about it. And then what do we do?
Well, I think NJEA does some great work with private grants. We bring families in. We actually are doing about 50 different learning sessions just for parents in English and Spanish, in person, in hybrid. So that's the types of things that have to happen. But it's hard to do that. I'm retired, so I'm doing that work consulting wise. But there are a lot of districts that are doing that work, and that work has to continue in order to serve the parents because they're the taxpayers right? I mean, they're just a couple ideas, Pat. We could talk offline.
And Pat, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So the narrative is that people don't have their working jobs, they don't have the time to participate. You're trying to shift. You're trying to shift that narrative. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And I'm saying, I think that, and I'm not comfortable with this, but I think I've bought into that. I have said to myself that the reason parents don't show up and don't work with their kids is because they are working 2 jobs or they don't have the time. And that may be the case, but I don't think it's the case in all instances.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So right. It could be, as Karen was just saying, it's not even just I'm busy. It's that this isn't the meeting is not held at a time that's convenient for me. Like, it's not offered in a language that I'm comfortable with. Like, the person who runs the meetings is openly hostile, or, you know, there's a lot of things that can kind of go into that, right? And that's a case where you have to start to, I think Carolyn, you're kind of getting into this, like, this is where you talk to people and say, like, you have to kind of identify some of those stakeholders and say, you know, what would incentivize, like how could we structure these meetings in ways that would, you know, be able, like, or would allow more people to participate, right? It's probably something you're already doing or having, but that's, you know, you start to kind of elevate like that narrative. I mean, you get some of these stories that kind of build toward a narrative. And this isn't even just like, it's interesting because, like, you know, do you work at a school? Is that?
I'm a retired educator, but I'm still working as a volunteer in schools.
And it's interesting to think about like story, and because like I'm a journalist and I think about, oh yeah, we're going to produce a story, it's going to run on a website, you know, but like story is just like, it's social, right? It's not like that you're going to, you know, produce like a multimedia narrative, right? That's going to run the local newspaper, but it's like how we, what are the spaces that we can elevate those stories, right? Is it in those conversations? Is it in those meetings, right? That Carolyn was, you know, those types of like one-on-one or like the group opportunities that you can actually share some of those stories. I think that's actually really interesting to me, is just like even thinking about the idea of like where we share the stories and how the stories are shared, because it's not even just like I need to write a news article, but you know.
Yeah, I think that's more what I was getting at, is how do we share the story of how do we, you know, the fact that not everybody in that community is part of that group that is, you know, uninterested or unable or whatever. How do we start sharing the stories of the successes that exist within that community?
Yeah, that could be, I mean, you know, is there a newsletter, you know, that the school produces?
Well,
is there an email
that's where
list?
the journalism
like,
comes in, right?
Yeah. Okay, maybe you could put, maybe there's a school newspaper, you could partner with some journalists to actually tell that story. Maybe get students involved, and you know, you create like an after school program where they're sharing some of the successes. You know, starting up, maybe there's a Facebook group. I like to think, I even tell journalists this, is like you go to where people are already talking, right? Is there a parent listserv? Is there a Facebook group? Do people use Nextdoor? Is there a hashtag on Instagram? I don't know. TikTok is a thing, right? Like, who are you trying to reach? And like, how do you go there? How do you tell the story in those places? And it's not going to look the same, right? It could be a Facebook post that's like, hey, I want to just shout out and tag this person who has been just doing some awesome stuff, like for, you know, their family, right? So those are some, yeah. So
that's
really
very helpful. Thank you.
Thinking about where people are, right, and how we kind of go to, and the different ways that we can offer it.
I found myself thinking, Pat, as you were talking, because you were sort of bravely stating that you're questioning your own mental models through doing this. I found myself thinking that I wonder if sort of stating that there are these shared assumptions about why people aren't engaged, and then framing it as, you know, this was an assumption, but now for me, it's a question. I wonder if that does work toward establishing a new narrative. I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but I found myself thinking that was what you were doing, and that it was very powerful to hear it coming from you. Reframing an assumption as a question.
Thank you. I like that concept of changing it into the question instead of an assumption. I appreciate that.
And I think that kind of dovetails with what Carolyn's question you asked, what happens when the narrative really true. I think then it is changing the question, right? Like, it's not just like, well, why, you know, this narrative is true because like the system is structured in a way that like perpetuates like this outcome that, you know, is the narrative that we see. It's like, well, how do we change the system? Like, how do we actually change it so that we get these better outcomes, right? I talk in terms of like better outcomes, right? We're talking about better outcomes or more people. Like, what are the possibilities here, and how do we kind of reorient to, okay, how do we shift the narrative in a way that, then we're talking about shifting a narrative in a way to what's possible. This is where we get to, I say a lot that journalism is focused on like accountability for the past, right? We talk about like how we messed up and what we did wrong, but not like what we could do, right? And that's where there's a lot of potential here. And this is where like a systems piece like kind of comes into play. How do we build better systems, right? How do we shift our systems? And that's where, you know, you can kind of build a big umbrella around that, because people want things to be good, right? Nobody wants things, I mean, not nobody, but like most people don't want things to be terrible, right? I mean, obviously, like, you know, there's racism, there's sexism, there's all of these things come into, all the isms come into play, and that's real, and we have to address that. And we can ask these questions of, you know, how do we make things better, and have that be a big umbrella? What's possible here? And so that's where we open up some opportunity too. I think we're at time. I really, really appreciate this conversation. I just want to acknowledge everyone else that has shared in the chat. I really appreciate all the good stuff. And Liz, even bringing in community colleges too. I appreciate you sharing that. And, you know, these narratives. I hope that this has been useful. And I think a lot of like what you shared is right on point. Like a lot of the individual examples that you've been offering and all the questions that have come up, like I really appreciate it. And I hope this has been somewhat useful and you get some tools or some ideas that you can kind of move forward with. I, again, will be sharing, Valerie was sending out the slides and everything. My contact info will be there. Always feel free to reach out to me if you ever have any questions or just want to bounce around ideas. Yeah, I hope we see each other again soon. So thank you all again for being here. I'll toss it to Karen too before we close.
Thanks, Cole. I just wanted to say that it's been so gratifying to hear all of your ideas tonight and to talk through some of the challenges that Cole posed at the beginning. One of the beautiful things about an event like this for us is to see the diversity of groups that come together as part of our community to wrestle with these sort of humanistic challenges and questions that have a huge ramification for our communities, for our democracy. I just want to throw out there that this is a program that we are always building and always working with. So if you have ideas about how you'd like to continue, the conversation tonight has been really wonderful, both in the chat and what we've been hearing from people. Inspiring, insightful, interesting. If you have thoughts about how you would love to see this conversation continued, shoot us an email, shoot an email to Valerie or even to me. And, you know, we're continuing to think about how to bring people together, because we really do. We think of our role at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities as being, as Valerie said at the beginning, as being in part a convener, just creating new conversations by putting people like you in a room together, trying to think about how we can solve our collective humanities rooted problems in New Jersey. So thanks for a really inspiring evening. I hadn't even realized that we were out of time until you said that, Cole. I was kind of shocked, despite the fact that we all said 20 minutes ago it was almost done.
It goes quick. It goes quick. Yeah.
Went really fast, but really thank you all for sharing. And we hope this will just be one among many conversations that we all get to have. So please stay in touch with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Stay well.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.